The conversation you're about to hear today on the Media Roundtable is the first time we've released the uncut conversations that became the short series, What's a Podcast? The Revolution Redefined. I'm Dan Granger, CEO of Oxford Road and Veritone One and host of the Media Roundtable podcast. We're giving you the full-length version of specific conversations we had with about 30 of the leaders of podcasting today. That includes creators like Ira Glass, Guy Raz, so many others, as well as leading publishers, advertisers, and thought leaders, where we tried to sit around the table and debate what is a podcast, why does it matter, why'd you get into this to begin with, and what do we need to do to preserve that into the future as we build a bigger definition of what podcasting actually is. Some of these conversations are a snapshot of a very specific moment in time, but they're all durable and timeless in the importance of the conversation. I learned a lot. For me, this whole project was a love letter to podcasting and something that is able to blend real business value with the passion that brought me and so many others into this field. And I think you're really going to enjoy it. So with that, please enjoy this next installment of the full-length interview series, What's a Podcast? Welcome to the Media Roundtable special edition. This is Dan Granger. I am your host, and I am the CEO of Oxford Road with Veritone One. We've been doing this show for a while, a little bit more than 5 years, and I was looking back to see the last time or the first time that we had today's guest on with us. And it turns out on April the 29th of 2020, a lifetime ago, we actually had our first official episode of this program, and our guest at that time was the CEO and founder of Wondery, which we all know is a powerhouse currently owned by Amazon, that really played a part in transforming what the podcasting industry became and would become. And since that time, so much has changed in the industry. So much has changed for all of us professionally. But we're welcoming Hernan back. This is a kind of an interesting way that we're setting this episode up because we have our full-length interview of my conversation with Hernan when we were going through the process of defining what is a podcast. So our What's a Podcast series that we put out, Hernan really was a thought partner to us, not just in the program, but also behind the scenes as we kind of thought through what the industry needed and was becoming and how to approach that. Hernan's been a friend for a long time, and so he was really helping us think through that process. So you're going to hear all of that discussion and his perspectives that were very illuminating in helping us land where we have. But since that discussion and since we came out with our report, Hernan has actually released a new report that we're going to be doing a little bit of a pregame to talk to you about. So you actually get two interviews for the price of one. We'll go a little faster to give you some of the background. But in the last week, Hernan, through his company Owl & Co., and he is the wise owl in that name designation, he has released the Global Podcast Economy, a new report giving a complete picture of where things stand today. And the data that he has released to the market, I think, is now sending shockwaves. I think it gave a jolt to the system that was needed. We've been talking about how much revenue the podcasting industry represents today, and the fact that it's been a little stalled out. But based on this new approach, there's a very different number with some very different implications. And so Hernan has agreed to join us today to talk through his report and the findings that I think have a lot of major implications for all of us. So Hernan, welcome back. Welcome to the show. And thanks for letting us get two episodes with you this year already.
Thank you so much. And again, I have to thank you, and we'll talk about this, for nudging me into create the Global Podcast Economy Report. I was already on the fence about should I do it? Is it needed? But it was really the conversation that we had with you a couple of weeks before we recorded the episode, and then finally after recording the episode, that really pushed me over the edge. And I'm glad that it's out and that we got it done.
Well, and you're getting a lot of attention for this. I know there have been a number of people chiming in across the industry, with some people calling it essential and a must read. And so I think just to start the conversation, can you just frame it for us a little bit and talk about the evolution of why you did the study, and really what the key findings are, and then we'll go through a little bit more granularly and unpack them.
If I can go into the backstory, my first attempt to find out how much money there was in the podcast industry was before starting Wondery in 2015. And the best number I could come up with and found, I can't remember what source, suggested that only $100 million were being spent on podcast ads in the US around that time. And one of the first things that I did when I started Wondery and Wondery became part of the IAB was I asked the IAB to put together a report measuring the podcast economy the same way that they have been doing it for the digital advertising economy for many years. It was a very successful, still is, very successful report they produced in the US and all around the world in many different markets, typically organized by an outside accounting firm where they go on and ask the publishers how much money they're making, and then they make an estimate for all the companies that don't report their numbers. And I saw that number grow over the years as I was at Wondery. It was $200 million, then 400, then 600, and then it got stuck. I noticed at around the $2 billion mark. This is after I had sold Wondery, as I kept talking to people as to why it was stuck, and a number of questions kept coming back. One was that the report only ever, as I'm talking the IB US report, only ever measured the advertising revenue spent in audio ads in the US. Why audio? Because the IB considered all of YouTube as digital video. So they didn't want to include the video podcast revenue into two different places. But the IB report also famously did not include consumer revenue, or what I come to call consumer revenue. That's the revenue that comes from subscriptions, from Patreon, from YouTube Premium subscriptions. And that was a significant but unmeasured part of the total global podcast economy. And then finally, probably the most difficult part of the study was how to measure international. The IB and others had done attempts to measure, actually done studies to measure a few markets, but nobody had really tried to do a comprehensive global measurement. And I felt that because the number was underreported, the industry has been underestimated, underinvested, and under misunderstood. And we saw a little bit of a sign of that in the podcast election. I think you and I talked about how many people were surprised about how much impact podcasts had in changing hearts and minds. And I think the same is true in the economic world.
Well, and I'm so glad you did it, because I have said and shared this at Podcast Movement, like, I believed that it was about double the size that we were reporting, but I couldn't prove it, and I didn't really know where to begin even in prioritizing how you would even arrive at a more accurate number. And so I'm so grateful that you did this and showed everybody. And what I'm hearing from you, just to kind of play it back, is IAB's been doing a great job. They've been giving us something to work with, but the kind of three material pieces of it that we're getting underreported, that were the reason we have such a different number here, is that one, you're saying there was no consideration for YouTube. Two, there was no consideration for programmatic. And three, nobody really went deep on trying to figure out what the global impact is. And so it really feels like you went the extra mile here. And I think at some point we should not bury the lead and say the number. I'll let you do the honors here, but I'd love to also have you just underscore a little bit the process that you went through to get this information, because I think if it was easy to get, we probably would have seen more of these coming out.
Right. You're right. It wasn't easy, but the big number, and most of your listeners, I assume, have seen the report. I estimated the global podcast economy to be worth $7.3 billion in around the world in 2024, and that comes from a combination of direct advertising sold by the companies as publishers or the podcasters themselves. Then within that, there's programmatic advertising, and that can be sold by platforms and some like Span or AdsWiz or Taz or YouTube AdSense. And part of that revenue goes back to the direct advertising pool. So I had to make an effort to not duplicate the same amount of revenue. Then there's consumer revenue. I think when you say programmatic, you meant consumer. The revenue that comes directly or indirectly by consumers. That can be support from Patreon, that could be subscriptions to single publisher apps like Wondery Plus or Podimo or Podme or Pocket FM. And that can be the share that YouTube paid of their premium subscriptions to podcasters. That's significant. And as of this year, Spotify is doing the same thing. So there'll be another new source of revenue. And then finally, there's a bucket I called the branded and work for hire podcasts. Those are shows that essentially are not counted as advertising necessarily because they're paid by a company, or they're made on behalf of a company that doesn't sell ads, like the BBC or Audible.
By the way, when you talk about consumer revenue, does that include merch, products, events, that sort of thing?
Good question. It does not. Actually, I initially thought I was going to try to measure also that kind of revenue. I abandoned the effort because it would have been too unwieldy. The other big kind of revenue I'm not counting are the minimum guarantees paid by all the publishers to the extent that they're higher than the actual revenue that they generate. You can make the argument that that all contributes to the podcast economy, but I did not attempt to quantify those for this study anyway.
Well, but there's really an X factor in there that could make the number even higher than where you're at, and I think that the big aha here is not even just the 7.3; it's the fact that it's basically double what people have been working off of. If you work on Wall Street and you're analyzing the sector, you were probably using that 2.4 billion, and now we're saying domestic, it is 4.7, right? So virtually, 100% growth on that. So that's significant. And why is it? Why is this important? What do you feel are the actual real world implications?
I think people are going to once again understand that podcasts are much bigger than previously understood, and that there's been a number of inflection points in the history of podcasts where this has been true. Serial being one example, the wave of M&A, Gimlet, Wondery was part of it, Ringer was another example, the podcast selection was another example. I think this will be another inflection point. And when investors, Wall Street players understand the economic implications, then investment flow where it needs to flow. Now, it is true that there can be sometimes too much investment flowing into opportunities that won't necessarily have time to monetize themselves. But I don't think that this is what's going to happen here. There's last time we had a wave of, by many people's estimates, or investment. We were living in an environment of very low interest rates. I think now we have true, genuine opportunity for podcast players across all sectors, including Oxford Road and Veritone One, to really capitalize on the success of what podcasts can do for brands, for companies, and for consumers.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. When the marketplace and people that are on the outside of it are deciding where they're going to place investment, whether that's just budgeting for ads or whether it is, like if we go in and we do a QBR with a client, they want to know what's going on in the marketplace. And if it looks like it's stalled out and flat, well, that supports an argument that their budget should stay flat, right? And then with outside infrastructure development, and we talked about this, we're going to talk about this later when we replay our last conversation. I think a lot of the type of work that Wondery was doing has been, high production value podcasts that are expensive to produce. A lot of that funding to wait for those to yield an ROI has gone away, and I think maybe there are new genres that are maybe under monetized that may be able to be explored, and new infrastructure and experimentation. So I think the message about the money being bigger than formerly thought will help the industry, and I think we all probably benefit from this downstream. I don't see a downside to it for anybody. Is there anybody that's pushed back on you since you put this out there?
Not a single one. Secretly, I was almost hoping that the number would be higher. And I think
Yeah.
the reason why it wasn't higher was that I believe that my estimates outside of the US are probably underreported. It was more difficult to get information outside of the US than in the US for just the number of sources that I had, and the different ways of checking information.
Programmatic is an interesting story within this, right? And it seems like the story is that programmatic on its own is already a $1 billion+ market. And I don't know that anybody really knew that. I can't imagine what you had to go through to get that information. But could you at least share, like, usually there's an 80/20 rule, right? Who are the publishers that are getting, or platforms rather, that 80% of this 1.6 billion is flowing through, do you think?
I think YouTube is the largely underreported story, and it accounts for a huge chunk of that number that you just talked about. And if you come back to the way YouTube quietly, but then in the last year, very vocally has established themselves as a significant player to the podcasting world. They had the announcement that 1 billion of their users listen to or watch podcasts every month. The announcement that 400 million viewing hours of podcasts on television sets are happening every month. And just last week, they launched a new ranker based on watch time of podcasts on YouTube and an editorial page. So YouTube is a giant advertising revenue engine, and they make last year $36 billion in total advertising revenue. So even a significant share of that $1.3 billion only accounts for a single-digit percentage of YouTube's overall revenue. But that was, again, revenue that was going to Joe Rogan and Kill Tony and Megyn Kelly and a number of podcasters that before was being lumped in as video revenue, and I think now should be counted as podcast revenue. They think so too.
So let me just spell that out a little further as people are thinking about it. So if you've got Joe Rogan, Megyn Kelly, you've got all of these podcasts that are getting significant distribution on YouTube, specifically now that we're kind of out of the age of gated content, right? And so now you've got really two different revenue streams that need to be counted. One of them is programmatic, which is being brokered directly by YouTube to its advertisers, totally kind of circumventing the publishers generally that we think about who put these things up. And then there's the part that YouTube doesn't get any taste in, which is the embedded ads that they have no monetization for, that the publishers do get an incremental reach and revenue stream from. It sounds like both of these things were not really being captured effectively.
That is correct. And the programmatic, I'm counting the first bucket, what you say, I'm putting that all in programmatic because it's sold largely as a programmatic way. But the
Well, sorry, but the 1.3 billion is how much of that is YouTube, do you think?
it's more than half. I don't want to disclose the
Sorry, 1.6, 1.6. So more than half of that is probably YouTube. And is that followed up by the usual suspects, Sirius, Pandora, and Spotify? Yeah. So do you think it's those three and then everybody else? You think basically you think 80% of it is YouTube, Sirius, Pandora, and Spotify making up really the whole programmatic marketplace.
I think yes, those are the leaders. Yes, yeah, but also there are other players as well, but those are the leaders. But you also take into account that this year that ranker will have a different composition because Spotify is making a very different play for video in that they're incentivizing their podcasters to upload video directly, and they're also sharing for the first time premium subscription revenue with the podcaster. So that goes into not advertising revenue but rather consumer revenue.
Got it. Okay. And then video podcasting, let's just stay on that for a minute. So which aspects, I guess we've already identified the programmatic piece was not being counted, and now you're counting that. What else, if video is now 30% of podcast revenue, what else was not being counted?
What I put in a difference of methodology between the way I did the report and the way the IB did it is that I started with very granular podcast by podcast data given to me by Magellan AI and Podscribe. They have incredibly granular data in the US. Magellan also gave me data for some international markets. And then we created a model that essentially measured how much revenue was being made by each podcast and therefore each publisher. And then with a team of people that helped me do the research, we went and back checked and triangulated all those data points just to refine the assumptions. So if one model said this company is making 50 and we heard good information that said that that company was making 60, well, that's being adjusted and the other way around. And by refining that model, we found out that the long tail was bigger than previously understood, that some podcasts, as you would expect, make more revenue than people think, and some podcasts make less. It's really the range of CPMs and fill rates are really the biggest drivers, in addition to obviously total audience. For YouTube, I had to create a model that first started with how much time spent on podcasts is happening, and then the model used revenue per 1,000 viewing hours, a concept of the streamonomics framework, and then allocated that to different countries based on data points I was getting from different publishers who are actually seeing their reports come in. So it was a pretty elaborate model. It's an estimate, so we'll never know how accurate it is. What I can promise to everybody is that if next year I change the methodology, or throughout the year I change the methodology, I'm going to tell people this is the increase based on the same methodology as we are applying now. So if we hadn't changed the methodology, the increase will be X.
There's a lot here. And when you look at the international marketplace, which is a big part of it, right? And we do a lot of business globally as well. And it's there's a lot to be done. And even though they're behind us generally, I had understood that the total global revenue to be about double that of the U.S. Now, here, what you found is that the U.S. has roughly 2/3 of that marketplace, but clearly, it continues to grow. It's probably not shocking to anybody to hear that China is top of the leaderboard, followed by the UK, followed by Germany, right? Do you believe there are certain parts of the world that are growing faster than others?
I do think I didn't attempt to do year on year growth rates. So that's a question that I'll be better placed to answer next year. I do think that the US has always had an advantage over many international markets. One is the US has had, thanks to you guys, a very strong business of advertisers supporting through direct response, supporting the podcast industry, and that industry, that layer doesn't automatically exist in other countries. The second difference is that the US has been a three platform market when it comes to listening. So there's Apple traditionally, and Apple, and by extension, the open RSS ecosystem, then Spotify, and then YouTube. In other markets, the bigger the penetration that Apple has, the better I think the chances are that the market is going to grow effectively in total consumptions. UK, one of the most probably surprising numbers. I think the IAB had estimated their total revenue at about 100. Again, that's advertising only, and that's only audio. I put the UK number over $300 million. When you look at the revenue published by Acast, publicly traded company from the UK, they alone reported $63 million in the UK. So that tells you that $100 million is not enough. It's not an accurate number. I do think that the dynamics will change this year given Spotify's push into video, and I think obviously that the industry, for things that happened before this report and probably after as well, will start to be looking at consumer revenue with a different lens. The fact that we had so much money coming from consumers directly or indirectly, I think will make podcasters and publishers put more attention into this line of business.
Yeah, definitely. And I know that this report was important because it establishes a new like a new baseline for the industry, right? And over time, you're going to be able to start seeing how that baseline changes and how the different facets contribute to that now that you've identified what the contributors are. Do you have a sense of where you anticipate the most growth or the fastest growth happening that will continue to drive it, since we don't necessarily have that view in this report?
As far as absolute numbers, I think the US will still, if you look at next year, just given the sheer scale of where we are, that probably that most of the growth will come from the US for a number of reasons. Outside of the US, I don't know any one particular market, but I do think that when we release this report next year, because of the change in methodology that will allow me to have more granular information, we'll see a bigger headline number in overseas markets. That doesn't necessarily mean that they grew faster. It might mean that we
We just measured it a little better.
We measured
Attribution. It's always attribution. And then, but what about as far as all of the revenue streams, not just the advertising market, the consumer market, the programmatic? Well, programmatic is advertising, but when you look at everything that you looked at, which one do you think is growing the fastest?
Advertising is still growing the fastest, right?
It is.
And because
Okay.
there are a number of different people are now realizing that if they add, and by the way, video is not for everybody. On the report, I go through all the trade-offs that publishers do before they decide that whether they should do a video podcast or not. Today, there was this great article about Kara Swisher and Scott Galloway's podcast that reportedly they expect it will make on average $25 million per year next year. A business podcast, obviously, a really good one. Never a video episode. They don't want to do it. They have video clips, but not video episodes. So that's just one data point that shows that you can actually create a great business with audio-only podcasts. But for most podcasts being launched today, video is going to be a very integral part of discovery. And I think it will create actually opportunities because I anticipate that other television streamers will enter the space. There was this report last month when Netflix released their earnings. Ted Sarandos was asked a question about video podcasts, and he more or less implied that he could be seeing a future where they come to the platform. So that's where Netflix goes in streaming. Usually others follow. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we see more participation from streamers in the space.
Yeah, no doubt. Okay, well, I appreciate that you've gone a little long with us on this, and certainly an important report. If you think about what we do with this data, and you look at the different stakeholder groups, whether it's advertisers, publishers, creators, what advice do you have for how we can not just be surprised by the data, but really put it to work? What do we do with this now that we have it?
I would say if you're a podcaster, understand the value of your audience and understand your opportunity cost. If you're an agency, know, and even though I made an effort not to go into vertical specific data points, that's a work that really the IB had done very well that I didn't have the bandwidth to do this year. I do anticipate that in future versions of the report, maybe we can go deeper into what strategies can drive results for different verticals. You and I have talked about attribution, how attribution has been the absolute fuel that really helped the podcast industry get to where it is today. And it's important that we get it right for the future as well. And finally, don't underestimate consumer revenue and video opportunities, but understand the trade-offs.
And just say a little bit more about those trade-offs one more time, if you don't mind.
If you're a video podcaster, right now we're doing this podcast in video. If you wanted to edit it, it would not be as easy to edit as if it were audio only. In audio, you can tighten the pauses and the just slightly off boring segments, and that people don't notice the difference. In video, they do. Booking guests is a very different ask when it's video compared to audio, especially when you're booking celebrity guests, people who have a very busy schedule, or business leaders, and especially when you're asking them to come in person. So those are just some of the trade-offs.
And if I could pick up one last detail with you, Spotify's push into video is going to have very material consequences. But how can you just thread that a little bit more deeply? What is the cause and effect of Spotify turning their gaze to video as they have?
I think if you look at the app today, it's clear that they want you to leave the screen on. And if they want you to leave the screen on, that will change the design of the app, the kind of content that they promote, and the kind of business models that they write with podcasters. One, I think, of the opportunities, and they had a data point. They talked about how they paid out $100 million to podcasters in the first quarter. And I think one of the opportunities that Spotify does in particular is that because their share of premium revenue to advertising revenue is flipped compared to YouTube, they have way more subscription than advertising. That in theory can give access to a broader pool of revenue that hadn't been available to podcasters before.
Got it. Okay. Well, this is fascinating, and thank you on behalf of everybody in the industry for putting this together. I think it helps us all, and more to come. And let the conversation continue. Appreciate you coming back.
Great. Thank you for having me.
It's always so great to have Hernan come on and share his perspective. If anyone has shown real mastery within this industry, it is him. And look, I don't think it should be lost on any of us that we've been running a whole industry, a multi-billion-dollar industry, and only counting about half of it. And that's what he's just revealed to us here. And now, as we transition into our original discussion, I hope you can see the pieces of the puzzle coming together here. How we define what a podcast is has massive implications. And if there was any question about how this affects our pocketbooks, I think Hernan's report does that quite well. When you don't define a podcast with video, you end up with a very different number of what happens when you do. And of course, the Spotify and the YouTube factors continue to be monumental in their impact on the size of the business and the size of the opportunity in this business. So with that, let's go to our original discussion with Hernan about the very identity of the industry. Welcome to the Media Roundtable podcast. I'm Dan Granger, CEO of Oxford Road and Veritone One, the two agencies uniting into one, and the largest buyer of podcast media in the known universe. We have a very exciting show for you today, and a very special one to me. because we started doing this show. Our first official episode, number one, was published in 2020, about 4.5 years ago. April 29th, 2020. Pandemic was early. We were in the first couple months. And I had a guest who was willing to take time out of his busy day for a podcast interview that no one would listen to, named Hernan Lopez, the founder and CEO of Wondery. And at that time, we were trying to figure out, how should the business community respond to all the changes going on in the world? And that show and that episode triggered what became the Media Roundtable as it is today, which really, we don't do this because we think it's a big reach play for anybody. The reason we do this program is to use a podcast as an open lab to address and unpack challenges that our industry faces, oftentimes from the perspective of the brands and the advertisers who power it, but also, things that are material to all stakeholders. And one of the things that is abundantly clear in 2025 in this business is that the industry is going through an identity crisis. And what brought us here and kind of the rules of engagement and even the way we understand what a podcast is changing all the time. There was an article that came out the day before we recorded this where somebody said that Joe Rogan is not a podcast. And meanwhile, Netflix is saying that they're looking to expand into the podcast business. So what we wanted to do in true Media Roundtable fashion is have an open discussion with some of the leading minds in the field who work in this business and around it to ask the question, what is a podcast? And to really talk about the implications of that and how we all got here. So I'm very excited to be joined by Hernan today. Hernan, I'm going to bring you into the conversation in a second, but I just want to talk you up for a minute here. Hernan created what arguably has become the gold standard in podcasting and really showed how to build a beautiful business model. Ended up exiting, selling it to Amazon in a story that was like right at the perfect moment when we were kind of peak consolidation. But it was a wonderful deal and a wonderful company, and really he built a house of bricks that's standing strong today. And now, not only that, he contributed as founding governor of the Podcast Academy, and today has an advisory business that I'm going to let him explain to us called Owl and Co. But through this business, he lets other people who are, maybe a few steps behind him in the field tap into his brain and relationships to build their businesses. So Hernan, welcome back. We are so grateful to have you. I'm sorry it took this long, but I'm glad that you're here now.
Thank you for having me. Such a pleasure. This is the first podcast interview I do about podcasts since I think how I built this, which was over a year ago. So it's an honor to be in your show.
Well, I'm in good company, and Guy Raz is actually going to be appearing on this series as well, because he's really, he chose this industry and he really used it as an anchor as an already successful journalist. And I think has really done a lot to expand the medium and show how new worlds can be created. And I think as this conversation continues, we should talk about. I think one of the big things at Wondery was you didn't just make podcasts, but you really created IP that you were able to leverage into other lines of business. And there's so much that has changed, but I think you really tapped into kind of the best of what the medium has to offer. But before we go back and really talk about the early days in the origin and then get into this whole question of what a podcast is, can you just at least catch us up a little bit about you today and tell us about Owl & Co.?
Thank you. I started Owl & Company about a year and change ago to help companies, founders, entrepreneurs, primarily in the IP industries, understand how to use economics to build their businesses. And I developed this thesis called streamonomics around the unit economics of streaming. That essentially what it does is that it connects viewership or listenership to dollars and cents. It's something that I've been passionate about for the longest time, all the way back to my early days at Fox, and then started wondering every business needs to understand unit economics, how you make a dollar and how you spend a dollar, and how to do it in a way that is scalable and can build an enduring business. And I was challenged by my investors, particularly in the Wondery days, all came from a tech background, and they all wanted to insist that we understood unit economics right. And I think was one of the misunderstood or underreported parts of the Wondery success story. But the companies that I work for today are primarily from the television world. North Road, the company that Peter Cherny started, and the Peter Cherny Group. It's an investor in multiple kinds of content and commerce business. Candle Media is an client of mine through Moonbag. Skybound, the creators of The Walking Dead, and a number of companies I'm consulting with more formally and informally that the names are not public yet. But I'm having a lot of fun.
That's awesome. Can I get you to give us just a little bit more on Streamonomics? Are you open with that formula on what the revenue potential is for a stream?
Yes, and I start from something that I think every company who's selling to a streamer, whether it's video or audio, should understand, which is the value of an hour of engagement. For example, Netflix makes $39 billion in revenue a year, and they drive 200 billion hours of engagement in viewing hours. So you can go back and very simply calculate how much revenue they make per 1,000 hours. And because you know how much they spend in content, about $15 billion a year, you can tell how much each hour of content is worth to them. So if you're somebody who's selling to them, either a licensor or somebody who's creating a show for them, you get a better sense or a better understanding of whether your show is likely to be renewed or not based on how it's yielding compared to other things that Netflix could be doing. And if you're a sports seller, let's say people who are selling the NFL Christmas Days games, you know they're going to be more expensive than a scripted show like Squid Game or Wednesday. But there are other ways in which they can leverage your property in order to gain advance their business, and then you use that to your favor in order to get the maximum possible yield. The same thing happens in podcasts. So when we were at Wondery evaluating how much we should invest on a show from a marketing perspective, we knew that the fixed cost of making the show was already done, but whether we spend X amount of money or 2X amount of money on marketing would make the difference whether the show would get 500,000 listeners or a million listeners. And the economics of scale were such that it made way more sense at the time anyway to spend whatever money we needed to in order to get the show in front of a million listeners. And all those lessons are applicable to pretty much any kind of on-demand media, from YouTube to podcast to television. And one of the things that I do is essentially help both buyers and sellers understand how to put all those economics to work for them.
Well, and you guys really, I think, wrote the book, and I know you had some ex Oxford Road folks that came over and helped as well, but it was great to get to have a sideline view of how you built that business, and I think one of the things that you really did master was the art of cross promotion, and really you were the first entity that got good at marketing a show. And I wonder, so much of I think where the business is moving is a function of how challenging it's been to market it. Do you think that today the rules that applied and made Wondery so successful, do those rules still apply, or has it all changed?
I think to some extent they do still apply. Obviously, I'm not as involved in the day-to-day of any one company to know how exactly they're spending the money today. But the biggest change that happened over the last 5 years, or four actually, this week has been 4 years since Wonder became part of Amazon, is that YouTube became such a more important part of the listening ecosystem and such a more important discovery mechanism that I think those dynamics have changed. The extent to which narrative series can be communicated to listeners and can break through on their own.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like if I can share it, is in the earlier days when you really built that business and you had so many smash hits. I mean, we can go down the list, but there were a lot of feed swaps. There were a lot of ads that you would run before another show. You would get cameos, getting people to cross promote on, a person from a podcast is promoting a podcast on a podcast. And that was actually kind of new at that time to create a methodology around that. But, to spell out what I hear you saying is the big shift now, with so much of the consumption being on YouTube specifically, is that now you can actually do short form cut downs and put them in reels and market them to audiences in a more targeted way than we ever could before, when iTunes was the dominant distribution platform. And I think that's driving a lot of that's the tail that's now, I think, wagging the dog in many respects in this industry. Would you agree?
I think so. And again, with the caveat that I'm not as directly involved in how specific shows are marketed today, what I see as a consumer, and I'm not a huge YouTube consumer, but I'm more on both. Spotify is my primary listening platform. Some of it is becoming video, and also still use Apple Podcasts in depending on the environment, and as well as the Wondery app, which still has the early access to all the Wondery shows. What I'm at the time that I was at Wondery, there was no substitute for audio only promotion. It was by far the number one tool, both by scale as well as conversion rate. And yes, feed drops were a minimum part of it, but not everybody listened to the feed drop. So you had to, on top of that, had significant share of ads, including the podcast, if they were host read better. But we found success across any kind of format. I am, though, noticing that I'm not seeing as many visual ads for narrative podcasts today as I did 5 years ago. And I don't know whether that's a function that less of them are made, or what it is.
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the big arguments going on for the kind of audio purists in the business is, there are certain shows that wouldn't have been able to be successful if, video production had been required at that time. For so long, it was just like, if there was a visual element, it might be an image slapped on a screen and static the whole time, right? But like the argument is, would you have Serial if you had the same requirements that are being asked today? Like, would that have been possible? Or is the industry shifting to something that's totally different because now video seems to be an expectation?
I think that both kinds of podcasts have a place and will continue to have a place. Remember, Serial was one podcast that nobody has been able to replicate. And it was a function of being the first one and being so great, and having a whole year when there was really nothing, nothing really comparable to it. And Serial, I told the stories that the podcast that inspired me to start Wondery, because I could not believe that there was nothing like it.
Serial was what inspired you to create Wondery.
The combination of Serial and then Gimlet, which happened about a year or maybe a few months after Serial, but more or less a year before I started Wondery. And I remember I told the story to Guy and others how I flew back. I was not a binge listener, or a binge viewer rather, of television shows. I watched 2 episodes at once, but because I was traveling a lot as part of my work, I will be coming back on a plane. I was coming back from a plane from London, which is an 11-hour flight, and I binge listened to the last, I believe it was 5 episodes of Serial in a row. I could not put it down. And then I really understood the power of that immersive story, very told from a perspective that you essentially you thought that you were a person in between Sarah Koenig and Adnan, and you really were feeling the feelings that both of them were communicating to each other when they were having those conversations. I remember thinking, I don't know that you could do this as effectively in video. I thought that if you try to add video to it would not be as effective. But at the same time, serialized documentaries
were relatively new. Remember that the traditional documentary was a 2-hour movie or maybe the 1-hour special. We ran at Fox, who were owners of National Geographic Channel, so part of my remit was essentially to see which kinds of documentaries had the broadest possible appeal. And it wasn't until The Jinx, I think, in 2015 or thereabouts, or maybe 2016, that somebody created a character-driven, serialized documentary. And that was the other point of inspiration for Wonder. So serial from the pure audio perspective and The Jinx from the narrative television perspective.
Well, and so, we haven't even talked about some of the kind of smash hits that you had, and so many of them, topped the charts. And, it was like, Motown Records or something. I mean, it was just hit after hit after hit for you guys. You had Dirty John, you had Dr. Death, you had We Crash, you had Bunga Bunga. I mean, so many. I have to be honest, this is embarrassing. I should know this already, but what did you do for the visual component with these?
We did nothing. They
Nothing.
were all audio only. I don't think there was even a conversation about creating them, because at the time, when you start a startup, when you start a startup, you have to be as focused as possible on what's working. And there were so many opportunities that were being thrown at us. And you talked about former Oxford Road. I heard Caro Chekla from Oxford Road. He's still there. He's an amazing executive. He was one of the first people to tell me we need to understand YouTube. We need to be present on YouTube. And I remember not engaging on YouTube at the time because our shows were narrative, were not interview style. So I could not imagine what visual component I would add to a narrative show like Dirty John or Dr. Death, unless it was a television adaptation, which of course we ended up making 7 of them over the next several years.
Well, and Caro is such a great example of, he's like a perfect metaphor for the industry and the Renaissance at that time. He showed up, we were at WeWork in 2014, and we were like barely a year old, growing like crazy. And this kid shows up, and real casual, not like I was used to people showing up for interviews, but he was clearly smart, and he just was obsessed with podcasts. He just was totally into podcasts. And not that, the thing we had to answer for advertisers all the time is, what's a podcast? Right. But this guy was way ahead of it. And he came into the business and rose up through our media team, and then ultimately jumped over to the Wondery side, and has been a true success story and force in nature in this business. Helped launch Chartable as well, and has done a lot of great stuff. And I feel like, that period of time, that decade, right, coming into when Serial hit and the period you ushered in, that was a real renaissance in media. And it sounds like, as you're describing your story and what drew you, it wasn't so much that you said, oh, I see a growing market, and I think there's a business opportunity. It sounds like you really were led by passion for the product, and then decided you wanted to try to match the quality and elevate the quality of what was there before.
To be clear, it was both. I was towards the end of my 18 years at Fox. Having been there, I knew I was going to get promoted, and I had this bug of being an entrepreneur for a long time before leaving Fox. But I was never landing on the right idea, the right moment, the right opportunity. And I remember so many people told me, you have to listen to Sierra with that intonation. You have to listen. Then it took me 6 months or so to finally listen to Sierra. Then I realized, okay, now this is why people are so obsessed with this. But at the same time, then the question of the business opportunity came insofar as, why is it that there are no more? Why is it that nobody has done Serial? And why is it that Gimlet had just started startup, and it was the other show. Why is it that there were 10 of those? Yeah. And partially was that there was no funding mechanism. So it really was taking the leap of faith that if you build enough stories like those, then the revenue would come. But we had to do a lot of work. We had to get obviously you guys alongside with Veritone, which is now part of Oscar Road, but also at Results.
Yeah, we need you. We need Owl and Co. to help us land the plane on a new name for the combined entity too, but we can take that one offline.
Happy to. Name is one of the things I love. But again, the total market for the few people that were brave enough to estimate it, put it at $100 million at the time. The launch was 2016, and we got together with with other publishers who were part of the IAB, and I went to the IAB and told them, look, you guys, for the last 15 years or so, have been establishing the digital revenue survey, where every year or every 6 months, I think they asked every agency and every publisher through PwC or EY, I can't remember which auditing house, how much money was being spent on digital. And every time there was a press release, digital advertising is up by 50, 30, 70%. And so it became a great marketing tool for the industry itself, because every agency or every advertiser that was reading that digital ads were increasing by so much was wondering, why am I not spending more on digital ads? So the goal was to create the same thing for the podcast industry. I think the first revenue study probably in 2017 and came out in 18 or around those times.
So going back to some of the hits that you had, I guess one of the questions is, could that have happened if video had been as prominent as it is today and as it's becoming?
I think it could have, yes. I think companies are wondering, still making hits today. Kill List, just to give you one example. There are a number of shows that are breaking through serial production, still making amazing content. I think the attention, the industry, the trade attention has moved away a little bit from their narrative style audio first podcast, because the personality driven interview shows are so much bigger, and they publish multiple episodes a week, and they're in your ears, eyes, with much more frequency than narrative podcasts. So they create a habit. If you look at podcasts, Edison Research top podcasts of Q4 or Q3, you'll find the top 10, they're all ongoing shows. Like they're The Daily, Rogan, Call Her Daddy, Crime Junkie. So that
whereas you were doing, and you were basically doing like the HBO of podcasting. I'm sure you've heard that one before, although probably couldn't say that at Amazon. But when you were doing that, I mean, just the cost to manufacture and the cost to get an hour of engagement on a relative basis, do you have any way to benchmark where that was or where that is today?
I haven't done the math recently, but I would think that it went up. I mean, it really, the cost of all content went up towards the 2019, 2021, 22 in particular. And it wasn't just on podcasts, although I saw it on the podcast space because we were competing for talent, we were competing for stories, and we saw that everything was getting more expensive. But look at what happened in television. And the television, just the so-called streaming wars, which obviously were at their peak from 19 until 22, you saw shows getting more and more expensive and not necessarily growing viewership at the same rate that they were growing expenses. So as a result, the cost of an engagement hour went significantly up. I think that's starting to reverse. In fact, it started to reverse itself little by little in 22 when there was the so-called great Netflix correction that led Netflix itself and everybody else that competed with them to look at their P&Ls and their costs more, to scrutinize more what they were spending. And it happened as well on the podcast space, although the forces in the podcast space were slightly different, but there were a combination of the changes in the iOS system that essentially made downloads sharply go down all of a sudden. And there were too many projects that got so much more expensive.
It got a little overbuilt. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, the pandemic was crazy. You had, you went to like 4 million podcasts in the library, and there just wasn't enough audience to keep up with the supply and the cost of that supply. So yeah, no, I mean, I think we were, as a buyer, it didn't, is fine for our clients, but on the production side, I know it was very painful for a lot of people. And I guess what I wonder is, I do think a correction needed to happen, but talking to somebody that was really at the center of building a business that was focused on quality and production, do you feel that the winds of change are making it less possible to do the type of work that you were doing? That's not to say that a talk show isn't valuable. That's not to say that all the different flavors of podcasting aren't, great in their own way. But there was something special. That's why I use the HBO thing, right? Like you were really creating something that was unique and setting the bar on the value of the content. And do you feel like that was a moment in time and we're not really going to be able to return to the same amount of supply for that because the economics are so hard and because of the shifts by platforms to just reward cheaper product?
So I think there's a function of the shift in platforms is probably as important as the increased competition. When Wondery was launching all these miniseries, Apple Podcasts was the dominant listening platform, and we knew how the ranking worked, and getting high in the rankings was a key way of getting our shows across. When podcast listening essentially splits in three, and then it became more difficult to break through in all three platforms at once if you were a new miniseries. More just an oversimplification of it. Then on top of that, yes, you do have that shows got more expensive to make, but people are making shows at all kinds of budgets today. So there's still, I think, I remark, and I mean, I talk to podcasts in small independent publishers today, and they are the shows are getting made and shows are breaking through. Again, Wondery had that benefit at that time of audience being concentrated and being overall less competition for the narrative storytelling podcast space.
And did you have outside funding when you started the company?
I did. I had a little bit. So I raised $450,000 between
okay.
a former employer and some angels, and then I thought it was going to be super easy. And we were planning for 2 years. I wasn't able to raise a Series A until 2018. So I had to
okay. And do you think that the shows that are breaking through today can do so being self-funded? Can you bootstrap your way there, or does it really require real backing and resources?
I don't know. I don't think so. I think most of those shows today, all of the kind of serialized narrative, investigative, from what I understand, most of them are going to Wondery, iHeart, and Odyssey for funding for essentially getting to Lemonada for single, essentially to get them off the ground. That's why I understand.
Have you ever heard of any of these companies? Shopify, Bayer, Oracle, Indeed, Masterclass, Babbel, Tommy John, LegalZoom, Constant Contact. We could go on, and we could go on so much further now that we're joining forces with our friends at Veritone One. We have created the world's largest specialist agency in audio and in podcasting. Nobody's ever done anything like this before, and it's an exciting opportunity for everybody involved. What we do at this agency is we offer comprehensive services for brands that are looking to break out and be successful in this space. We call you the chief audio officer because we believe that what you need requires real specialist work. And the way that we approach it includes proprietary methods in media planning and buying, analytics and attribution, insights. We have a proprietary process called Audiolytics, which is our trademark method for creative development that allows us to score ads for their persuasiveness. Audio isn't just the work that we do, it truly is our passion, and we aim to elevate this industry to new heights. And that's why we're the leaders in brand safety and suitability, as well as in volume in the space. We try to provide solutions that ensure that your ad buys align your values that you have as a brand with your business metrics that you need to be successful. This stuff is hard, but we're here to make it a little bit easier for you. And if you're a chief audio officer seeking best in market performance at maximum viable scale, please get in touch with us. Do the right thing. Go to oxfordroad.com. And if you're passionate about audio, if you're strategic, if you're relentless, and you're looking for a career change, consider joining our mission as an agent of influence. Send us your resume through our website, oxfordroad.com. influencerpodcast.com. We made it really easy to spell. Sign up for our free newsletter, The Influencer, and be sure to mention that you heard about us right here on the Media Roundtable podcast, because attribution is important. Thanks, everybody. Okay, I want to get to the main topic here, which is, getting you on record to say, what is a podcast?
I thought about it a lot. So the best definition I landed on is a show designed around the human voice, meant to be consumed on demand. Consumed, rather, enjoyed on demand instead of consumed. And I think the elements of that are, it's a show that is designed around the human voice, means it has to, I think you pointed me to James Critland, gave this great definition about being audio first. So you have to be able to enjoy, even if it has a video component, you have to be able to enjoy it with the video turned off. So I think that's crucial. That's key. I say around the human voice to make sure that our definition doesn't accidentally capture audiobooks, because audiobooks are designed around words on paper, and then they're read by somebody else, but they're not designed around the human voice. And they're also meant to be enjoyed on demand or enjoyed on your own time, however you want to say it, because a live radio show that then gets republished as a podcast sounds fundamentally different, right? You have promoting, you have people calling in, you have that urgency that is very unique to live radio that you just don't sense in something that was designed from the get-go as a podcast. But I use a human voice instead of audio or sound, because I want to make sure that this is really about conversations about, again, the human voice and not about the music. Although music is a component, Foley is a component of podcasts, but even video podcasts, from Rogan to Diary of a CEO to Call Her Daddy, they're really designed around the human voice. So that's why I landed on. What do you think?
I think it's really good. Let me pick at it a little bit, just because that's what we're doing here. But yeah. I think you've got a really good framework. So a show designed around the human voice, I think that checks out, and I'm hearing a chorus around that one. But one technical question: human voice, can AI produce a human voice, or do you bounce it out if it's AI created?
Interesting. So
it's tough, right?
It is tough. I think we're far away from that, and I have not heard yet to this day any fully AI generated voice that consumers cannot feel that it is AI generated. Now, I've seen use cases of AI being used for edits, and to the extent that with the host's approval, that can save them time and make sure that the show ends up getting produced faster, I'm all for that. But I don't think that we're ready to welcome a fully generated AI voice into a podcast.
Well, so here's where I'll just bookmark this one as we keep thinking about it. But it's interesting. I think about the work that Spoken Layer was doing or does, and I was on this. I probably gave you a rant about it in 2019, how I felt that smart speakers were the future, and I still actually think dynamic audio is it hasn't had its moment yet. But I think if you consider that all of the publications you would like to read, that you could actually have all of your newsletters converted into podcasts by AI. If I love reading the Free Press, and then I want the voice of the author to give me the 3-minute summary, the 8-minute summary, if I want to time it to my commute destination and have it, I think that's where it's got to go, right? And so I think we have to allow for the kind of remanipulation of on-demand media to fit to things that you really can't do with just humans talking to humans, even though I do think that the authenticity is such an important element. I mean, what do you think about that idea?
I do agree. Look, I mean, I do think that eventually maybe we'll get there. I think the quality needs to be a lot better than it is today.
Yeah.
And there are interpretations, there are ways in which actors read or voiceovers or hosts read something, and then AI comes in and completely changes the tone or the pitch. But it's still their voice. They're the ones doing it. So I do think that some element of human performance is needed. But
Well, and even the AI
yeah,
voices are replicating human, right? So I think there's a way that definition might actually still hold and be able to encompass that. The other piece I'd say is you use two terms interchangeably. You said consumed and enjoyed. Because you're the creator of Wondery, I understand why you said enjoyed.
enjoy.
Now,
Yes, sounds better.
I'm into the type of self-harm where I only do nonfiction, and I don't always listen to things just to enjoy them. Sometimes I'll just do it to learn, and I think there's a lot of content out there that we'll listen to, and sometimes we have a more utilitarian function for that, although there can be joy in that. I mean, you just happen to have a bias toward doing things that are creating very enjoyable products, which thank you for doing that for humanity. But I think if we're talking industry definition, I like your consumed more than enjoyed.
You're right. 'Cause it's broader, right? It's just, it encompasses news, for example, which they're not necessarily enjoyable.
Yeah. I mean, the common denominator that I think keeps coming up is I think we're all grasping for a way to reconcile that this is voice led and that it's on demand. And I think what you're distinguishing with radio is really interesting, because I don't know if it is a podcast, if it's not, if it is created for a live environment. I guess it could be. It can certainly be repurposed and distributed. But would you call it a podcast, or is it a radio show or a streaming show that gets made available on demand? And that's sort of like back catalog stuff, right?
I think it's more of the latter, right? I mean, look, it's and no definition is going to be perfect. I was thinking, just to give an example of how, and if we watch the Diary of a CEO, right, and the show is an interview show. It's incredibly well produced and it's edited and it's well lit. And compared to, and I'm going to age myself, I was not a heavy viewer, but Charlie Rose, right?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Was a show that at its peak was one of the most popular interview shows that, from the point of view of production value, less sophisticated than Diary of a CEO. In many respects, they have the edits, they have the lighting, they have but you really cannot distinguish one from the other, right? So it will be hard to come up with that definition of a podcast that doesn't also capture the old Charlie Rose show, or a definition of a television show where Diary of a CEO isn't also included.
Yeah. Oh, you know what else I was thinking when you were talking about it, and with the Netflix article specifically. So it looks like they just renewed. Did you see the John Mulaney "Everybody's in L.A." the six-parter that he did?
That's great.
It's super offbeat. It's random. It's ridiculous, but I thought it was fun, and I really applauded that he did something experimental, and he just leaned into it to the point where it worked. And so they just renewed him, and that was being discussed in the article about podcasting, right? So in their view, they are thinking of that show as a podcast, which in many ways it is, except that he actually did it live and had people that were calling in. Now everybody calling in was bullshit, but it was so it was staged. But the idea of a live call-in show, like even at Netflix, there's so much subjectivity in these definitions, right? And I think one of the ways that this becomes really important for us is we think about, if it's going to be ad supported, advertisers need a way to define what channel they are buying and what the budgets are for that channel. Right. And if we can't actually create a strict definition, then there's always going to be this kind of fluid nature of, is this influencer marketing? Is this YouTube? Is this creator-based media? Is this podcasting? So I think it's important that we land on something. And I think you've got a lot of the right elements of it there. I think the idea of distinguishing it from something that is made to be distributed live more so than on demand. Maybe that's like the video thing, where it's like it can have a video, it can have a live component, but it doesn't lose its value. Now a sports game loses its value, news loses its value,
Right.
but I think there is something about what it is programmed toward, and if it holds its value in an on-demand space, maybe there's something about that in the definition.
Sorry to interrupt. In news and sports, one of my mentors at Fox, David Hill, always told me you're meant to be able to join in progress. So when you watch a newscast, you see how they're shouting and they're loud and they're very brief because they assume that people are going to be coming in at any one time. Whereas you create a podcast assuming that people are going to listen from minute one.
Mm-hmm.
That's, I think, a key distinction.
So if we took this definition, I mean, we keep bouncing around. We were supposed to be at like 7 billion by now. In the pandemic, that's what they're forecasting. But it seems like it's like, no, we're going to call it 2, and we're going to hold that for the next few years. $2 billion is an ad-supported industry, right? Do you think that if we expanded the definition as you're thinking about it, so that there was more of what's being captured on YouTube became a podcast, are we actually dealing with a much larger industry than what's currently being reported?
1,000%. In fact, I wrote about this yesterday on LinkedIn. That $2 billion very often cited number comes from the IAB revenue survey, and it comes from the definition of podcast at the time that was available in 2017 or 18 when we started doing the survey, which was very much driven to that audio only RSS based traditional definition. So it definitely leaves out YouTube podcast, definitely leaves out subscription, leaves out international, leaves out minimum guarantees and other kinds of revenue sources that are integral to podcast monetization, but are not necessarily capturing those $2 billion. I haven't tried to come up with my own estimate of the podcast industry, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's multiples of that $2 billion.
Yeah, I've been having fun with chat trying to model this out, and I think my estimates are that it's actually domestic, probably closer to a 4 to 6 billion.
Domestic alone, okay.
Yeah, and then I think you probably double that for international, although it's hard to keep up. So let's talk about the advertising component for a second. Near and dear to my heart, but important to the industry. So when you do your Streamonomics model and when you apply that to podcasting, I mean, how much of a dollar on average today do you think is advertising driven versus all other forms of revenue? I know it's impossible to be precise, right?
Yes. I still want to say it's probably 80% plus.
80% ad revenue.
Ad revenue.
Yeah.
I still think that's I might be higher, right? Because when I was wondering, we had a goal of being less dependent on advertising, but we had two. One ongoing at the time, very small on Wondery Plus, which was subscription, but then we were really meaningful revenue from television, and that television pie has dried out because the streaming wars are over, right? And
you probably hit the high water mark for a network. I mean, there's shows that are subscription only, but for a network, you probably rung the bell on highest percentage of non-advertising supported revenue. So
at the time, I think.
Yeah, what was the peak that you got to, if you can disclose?
That would be part of the Wondery NDA, but it was very meaningful. It
was meaningful.
And it was recurring revenue as well, and it was, and again, because we had the option fees and then the first look deal. And
I mean, you really revolutionized the revenue model in many ways, and just taking the IP, like we were talking about, and turning that into series. I mean, how many of your shows ended up on a screen as a totally different production?
7 actually ended up made, and then I don't know how many more got option. I want to say that we got 30 option overall, and then some of them may still get made, right? But I'm less up to date on to the progress.
Yeah,
but 7 actually got made, and the 7th one is about to air this spring is Dying for Sex, which was the winner of the Emmys in 2020.
And you actually helped launch the Ambies, yeah?
I did.
Okay, and just because we're talking about it, can you just give a little backstory on that?
I think it was, coming towards the end of 19, I came to the realization that the industry was balkanizing a little bit. I mean, Spotify wanted to become a destination. It was clear that they were taking share of listenership from Apple, and they wanted to create exclusive podcasts. They were more concerned about exclusivity than before. And I was an independent at the time. Wondery, remember, was still not part of Wonder or any big company. We were competing, but at the same time had shared goals with huge companies like iHeart and Apple and Spotify and medium-sized companies like Wondery and other independent producers and public radio, NPR, WNYC. And so I wanted to create an organization that represented everybody in the podcast industry. But I knew that a trade organization wasn't going to be necessarily the way to go. And then realized that we did not have a professional award-giving membership organization like television had, the MPTPS, and the movie industry had AMTAS, and Television Academy had the organization that gives the Emmys. So I wanted to create essentially the equivalent of the Emmys, the Grammys, the Oscars for podcasts. So that was the vision, and the first meeting was in 2020, and they're now 4 years old. They're about to give the third or the fourth, I forget, Emmys
Wow.
next month.
Wow. And look, I know we're running out of time, so there's just a couple kind of final issues I want to touch on with you. Going back to the revenue model. So it sounds like if you're forecasting for the industry, you're building a business around what, the general theme that we're thinking about, that is podcasting. You're probably looking at 80 cents on the dollar is going to have to come from advertising. And that's, being generous, because there's a lot of businesses that just don't even have those ancillary streams, right? But do you think that the advertising piece should factor into the definition? Because ultimately, consumers might have a view, and publishers might have a view, and creators might have a view. But if 80 cents on the dollar is decided by a brand that had to code it as something, it would seem to me that might be material. And so one of the things I've been thinking about, and push back on me, because I know that this is like, I'm a little bit biased on this issue and thinking that advertising is super important. But do you think that the notion that one of the features of a podcast is, yes, audio led, yes, on demand, but also potentially that it lends itself to a different type of advertising that is not available through other types of media, namely the endorsement by a creator or producer or host?
I definitely think that that's a very strong feature. I don't know that is so distinctive that makes it discriminative.
Yeah, well, let me qualify it one last way. Let me qualify one aspect of it. I don't think that you would have to have it. I don't think you have to have host ads or producer ads in a show for it to be a podcast.
That's what I meant. Right.
But I do think that the content should mirror other shows that do, if it is a podcast. So you can be Sam Harris and you can say, I'm an all subscription business, but your format should be the same as those who do that. Because I think that one of the things that makes a podcast is the fact that there's a barrier that came down between the audience and the creator and the accessibility of it, right? And before this thing all becomes like any, we just call them shows or whatever, I do think that is a feature that can help distinguish it from other types of content.
I do think that's right. We're arguing over just a little technicality. I mean, I don't know that if a show wants to be just done for no revenue purposes. For example, I can't tell you, and I know I'm going to embarrass myself, I can't tell you I ever remember seeing an ad on Diary of a CEO.
Yeah.
I watch it on video, but maybe he does do ads. But even if he doesn't do ads, it's clearly a podcast. Even if it's video, it's clearly a podcast in my mind anyway.
Well, and I think that's the point. So I agree with you. I think the way it would have to be written into the definition would be something along the lines of that. It's the type of content.
Right.
Yeah, it is capable of it. It is. It is capable of exactly. Because I think that's a feature that they kind of can't take away from us as we're distinguishing. So, last question for you, and thank you for being so generous with your time. Why does this question even matter? What a podcast is? Am I making too big a thing out of this, or is this actually an important issue?
I think it is important because podcasts have a cultural impact. For podcasts, I mean, the Edison Research has been tracking podcasts as a word for 20 years now, I want to say, and maybe less. But if they're asking Americans and then people around the world, have you listened to a podcast in the last 30 days, week? And the results are going to come out next month, I think, for 2025. We need to all have some sort of a shared understanding of what a podcast is. And for a podcast industry to continue to exist and thrive, we need to have a shared evolving understanding maybe of what a podcast is, but yes, we need to have a working understanding. It doesn't need to be about RSS feeds, doesn't need to be about what kind of, like, who listens. It doesn't need to be about length, whether it's conversational or serialized. But we do need to agree broadly on what a podcast is. And I think I commend what you're doing with the series to get us all to talk about what it is, and I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out.
Well, thank you so much for joining the conversation. And this is not just because it's been 4 years since you've been on this show doesn't mean it's a bookend, but maybe it's the end of the beginning of your appearances here. And I hope you come back sooner than later. And I'm just really excited to continue the conversation with you. So thanks for being here, but also thanks for everything you've done to really push this industry forward. You really have made a tangible impact in an industry that we all love. That's also been able to help us, have jobs. So thank you for that.
Thank you, and thank you. Were one of the people who were with me that helped me wondering what it was, and so thank you back.
Till the wheels fall off, we're here. So and thank you to all of you for joining the Media Roundtable. This podcast is brought to you by Oxford Road and Veritone One, where we want you to succeed in audio, but also to use your influence for good. We have the power in this industry to advance voices that don't just entertain but edify, and to preserve fair-minded discussion around the most important topics of our age. If you're a marketer and you want to align your brand values with extraordinary business outcomes, reach out to Oxford Road or Veritone One, but your best form capture is at oxfordroad.com, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. It's free. If you want to email us, it's info@mediaroundtable.com. Don't forget to check out Ad Infinitum, our creative focused podcast. And again, thank you to Hernan, to Haley, to Ruby, Bianca, Kyle, Ezra, Mary Jane, Everett, Neil, Sean, the team at Podcast One. And as always, influence responsibly. That was another conversation from our full series, What's a Podcast? And whether you're a podcaster, an advertiser, or somebody who just cares about this space, I hope this stretched you. It's certainly stretched me and is giving us a lot to think about in how we want to live going forward and protect and preserve the essence of the medium while preparing for the changes we need to make to evolve on the road ahead. If you want to hear the full limited 3-part docuseries, What's a Podcast? The Revolution Redefined. Check it out wherever you listen to your shows. But if you want to go beyond that and you want to be a part of the movement that we've got here, it's not just about our defining it. It's about figuring out a path forward. Go to our link in the show description and download our free white paper, What is a Podcast? That has research from over 4,000 Americans on what consumers believe that the industry is. And make sure you sign our petition, also available in the link in the show description, to keep podcasting open. You know, this show is not just about content, learning, or entertainment. This is about having a real effect in the real world on issues that are important to all of us. We hope you'll continue to be a part of it and bring this into real life. Go to oxfordroad.com for more resources or click the links in the show description. Thanks for your time.
McCrispy strips are now at McDonald's. Tender, juicy, and its own sauce. Would you look at that? Well, you can't see it, but trust me, it looks delicious. New McCrispy strips, now at McDonald's. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.